Wall Street in the 1980s was a world fueled by ambition, excess, and a growing obsession with debt. In his prologue, Michael Lewis recalls his time at Lehman Brothers, a bond trading firm where the focus shifted from stocks to a new, highly profitable venture, packaging and selling America's debts. But behind the glamour and staggering bonuses was a troubling reality: most people in the industry didn't fully understand the products they were creating. Lewis suspected this culture of recklessness and ignorance would one day implode. Fast forward 2 decades, and the warnings Lewis saw had only grown louder. The mortgage bond market, a relatively new creation, was spiraling out of control. What began as a way to bundle safe home loans had mutated into a dangerous game, with loans being issued to borrowers who couldn't possibly repay. These subprime loans were stacked into complex financial products, shuffled around Wall Street, and sold to investors across the globe. Few questioned the risks until a small group of outsiders started to investigate. Steve Eisman was one of them. He wasn't your typical Wall Street analyst. Blunt and unapologetic, Eisman had a knack for spotting lies and exposing companies built on shaky foundations. When he turned his attention to subprime lenders, he found an industry riddled with fraud and greed. Companies like Lomas Financial and Oms Financial weren't just lending money, they were using accounting tricks to mask the fact that their loans were failing at alarming rates. Eisman realized these lenders weren't concerned about defaults because they sold off the risk to Wall Street banks. He called out the deception, earning himself a reputation as a troublemaker and a visionary. Meanwhile, in a small office in California, a reclusive hedge fund manager named Michael Burry was uncovering a bigger problem. Burry pored over bond prospectuses, documents so dense that most people ignored them. What he found was shocking. The quality of the loans being bundled into bonds was rapidly deteriorating. Borrowers were being given mortgages with low teaser rates that would reset to unaffordable levels within 2 years. Worse, Wall Street firms were betting everything on the assumption that these loans wouldn't default. Burry saw an opportunity. He realized that if he could bet against these bonds, he could make a fortune when the defaults inevitably came. But the financial system wasn't designed for people to bet against it. So, Burry convinced banks to sell him a new kind of insurance: credit default swaps. These allowed him to wager on the collapse of mortgage bonds. The banks, blinded by their own greed, gladly took his money, confident the housing market would never fail. As Eisman and Burry pursued their investigations, others joined the hunt. Small hedge funds like Cornwall Capital stumbled onto the same insights. These outsiders saw what Wall Street couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. The housing market was a house of cards, ready to collapse. They understood that the very complexity of mortgage bonds was being used to hide their fragility. Investors were buying products they didn't understand, trusting ratings agencies that were incentivized to stamp everything with AAA ratings, even as the foundations crumbled. In the end, the financial crisis of 2008 wasn't caused by one bad decision, but by a system that prioritized short-term profits over long-term stability. Wall Street created a machine that fed on risk, rewarded recklessness, and ignored the consequences. When the housing market collapsed, it triggered a global economic meltdown, wiping out trillions of dollars and devastating millions of lives. But for Eisman, Burry, and a handful of others, the crisis wasn't a surprise. They had seen the warnings, connected the dots, and bet against the system. Their stories, as told in The Big Short, are a stark reminder of the dangers of greed, ignorance, and the blind faith that the market will always correct itself. This is the story of how the financial world failed and the few who dared to call it out. Steve Eisman didn't set out to change the financial world, but his journey began with a knack for questioning everything. A corporate lawyer turned equity analyst, Eisman was placed in the heart of a growing industry that most ignored: subprime lending. At the time, subprime loans were marketed as a way to help struggling Americans refinance their debt and stay afloat. But Eisman, known for his sharp wit and brutal honesty, quickly realized that the reality didn't match the story these companies were selling. In his first major assignment, Eisman evaluated a subprime lender called Oms Financial. The more he dug, the more the cracks began to show. The company operated on a simple premise: lend money to people with bad credit, charge them high interest rates, and then sell the loans to investors. It seemed like a profitable model until Eisman looked at the numbers. Many of these borrowers were already missing payments, and the loans themselves were structured in ways that almost guaranteed failure. Eisman didn't hold back. He publicly criticized the company, calling out its unsustainable practices. His boldness shocked colleagues and enraged executives, but he was right. Within months, Om's Financial began to crumble under the weight of its bad loans. Eisman's skepticism deepened as he turned his attention to the wider subprime industry. These lenders weren't just making risky loans. They were packaging them into securities and selling them off as investments. Wall Street, eager to profit, didn't just enable this behavior, it actively encouraged it. The complexity of these mortgage-backed securities made it nearly impossible to understand the risks buried within them. But Eisman had an instinct for finding the truth. He once famously described one of these companies, Lehman Financial, as a perfectly hedged financial institution. It loses money in every conceivable interest rate environment. It was this kind of unfiltered analysis that made him both feared and respected. Yet Eisman wasn't just interested in numbers. He was drawn to the human side of the story. He saw firsthand how these loans exploited the most vulnerable borrowers, people who didn't fully understand the terms or couldn't afford the payments. Subprime lenders dressed up their products with phrases like home equity and low monthly payments, but Eisman recognized the trap. Borrowers were being set up to fail, and when they did, the consequences rippled far beyond the individual. Whole communities were being destabilized, all in the name of profit. What made Eisman stand out wasn't just his ability to predict the collapse of these companies, it was his refusal to accept the industry's excuses. While many analysts toed the line, Eisman spoke up, even when it cost him. His early warnings about the subprime market were dismissed as alarmist by some, but he was unrelenting. He wasn't afraid to call executives liars to their faces or challenge entire industries to justify their practices. Eisman's journey in Chapter 1 sets the stage for the central theme of The Big Short, the consequences of unchecked greed. Subprime lenders weren't inherently evil, but their business model was built on a lie that Wall Street perpetuated and profited from. Eisman's willingness to confront this lie made him a controversial figure, but it also put him on the front lines of uncovering a financial system on the brink of collapse. As the subprime market grew, so did the stakes. Eisman knew the system couldn't sustain itself forever. He just didn't yet know how big the crash would be or how much the rest of the world would pay for Wall Street's mistakes. In Chapter 2, we meet Michael Burry, an eccentric and brilliant hedge fund manager who spent most of his time alone, buried in research. Burry wasn't your typical Wall Street figure. He had a medical degree, an unconventional background for someone in finance, and a social awkwardness that often made him an outsider. But Burry's genius was his ability to see patterns that others overlooked, and his obsessive nature led him to uncover the cracks in the subprime mortgage market before anyone else. It started with curiosity. In 2004, Burry began examining the mortgage-backed securities market. These were complex financial products that bundled thousands of home loans into bonds, which were then sold to investors. On the surface, they seemed stable, rated highly by agencies like Moody's and S&P. But as Burry dove deeper into the prospectuses, hundreds of pages of fine print that no one bothered to read, he noticed something disturbing. The quality of the loans was deteriorating rapidly. Many of these loans, particularly subprime loans, had teaser rates, artificially low interest rates that would reset after 2 years, often doubling or tripling monthly payments. These loans were being issued to people with poor credit histories, low incomes, and, in some cases, no documentation at all. Some borrowers didn't even understand the terms of their loans. Others were knowingly taking on debt they couldn't repay, betting that rising home prices would bail them out. To Burry, it was clear. These loans were destined to fail, and the securities built on them were nothing more than a ticking time bomb. Burry's insight didn't stop there. He understood something even more important. The financial system wasn't just making bad loans, it was actively betting on its own success. Wall Street was confident that the housing market would never decline. Home prices had risen steadily for decades, and this blind optimism fueled even riskier lending practices. But Burry didn't share their confidence. He began searching for a way to bet against these subprime mortgage bonds. That's when he discovered credit default swaps. These were essentially insurance contracts that allowed investors to bet on whether a bond would fail. If the bond defaulted, the holder of the credit default swap would receive a massive payout. Burry realized that this was his opportunity. He approached big banks like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, asking them to sell him swaps on subprime mortgage bonds. At first, they were confused. Why would anyone want to bet against something as safe as housing? But they saw no harm in taking his money. To them, it was easy profit. By 2005, Burry had poured millions of his fund's capital into these credit default swaps. His investors were skeptical, even angry. Why was he betting against the housing market when it was booming? But Burry was undeterred. He knew it would take time, 2 years, maybe 3, before the teaser rates on these loans reset and the defaults began. But when they did, the entire market would collapse, and his bets would pay off spectacularly. What made Burry's story extraordinary wasn't just his foresight, it was the sheer loneliness of his conviction. No one else saw what he saw, and those who did lacked the courage to act. He wasn't influenced by Wall Street's groupthink or the prevailing narrative that housing prices only go up. He relied solely on data, logic, and his own obsessive drive to uncover the truth. As Burry quietly built his position, the larger financial system carried on in blissful ignorance. Banks continued to churn out subprime loans, investors poured money into mortgage-backed securities, and rating agencies slapped AAA labels on products that were anything but safe. All the while, Burry sat in his office, watching the market edge closer to disaster. Chapter 3 takes us deeper into the heart of the subprime mortgage machine, exposing how it turned the dream of homeownership into a trap. At first glance, the system seemed to be helping people, offering loans to those who wouldn't traditionally qualify. But beneath the surface, it was a house of cards. Wall Street's relentless hunger for profit had created a perfect storm of fraud, ignorance, and exploitation. At the center of this chapter is the concept of the liar's loan, officially known as a no-doc or stated income mortgage. These loans required no proof of income, no tax returns, no real verification of a borrower's ability to pay. The idea was simple: speed up the process, issue more loans, and feed Wall Street's insatiable appetite for mortgage-backed securities. Borrowers were encouraged, often by unscrupulous brokers, to inflate their incomes. As one broker famously quipped, "How can a guy who can't speak English lie?" This wasn't just a few bad apples, this was systemic. Mortgage brokers earned commissions based on the volume of loans they closed, not the quality. The incentive was clear: get anyone into a house, regardless of their ability to afford it. Borrowers, many of whom didn't fully understand the terms, were offered low teaser rates that would skyrocket after a couple of years. They were betting on rising home prices to bail them out. Meanwhile, brokers and lenders pocketed their fees and passed the risk up the chain. The loans were then bundled into securities and sold to investors. But to make these securities marketable, they needed a stamp of approval from rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's. These agencies, paid by the very banks they were supposed to be evaluating, gave AAA ratings to bonds filled with subprime loans. It didn't matter that the loans were backed by shaky borrowers or that many would default as soon as the rates adjusted. The AAA rating made them appear safe, convincing pension funds, mutual funds, and foreign banks to buy in. The chapter vividly illustrates how every player in the system, the brokers, the lenders, the banks, the rating agencies, profited from the deception. No one cared about the long-term consequences because the risk was always passed along. Borrowers couldn't afford the payments? Not their problem. Securities filled with bad loans? Someone else would own them when they collapsed. As defaults began to rise, a few outsiders like Steve Eisman noticed the cracks. He attended industry conferences where executives assured everyone that subprime lending was safe, using complicated jargon to justify their practices. But Eisman wasn't convinced. To him, it was all smoke and mirrors. He realized that the entire industry relied on one assumption: that housing prices would never fall. It was a fragile belief, and Eisman knew what would happen when it broke. The system's flaws weren't just financial, they were moral. Brokers exploited vulnerable borrowers. Rating agencies ignored obvious risks. Wall Street's greed was hidden behind layers of complexity, but the truth was simple: The system was designed to benefit a few at the expense of many. It wasn't just about bad loans or greedy brokers, it was about a system built on lies, and the cracks were beginning to show. Chapter 4 peels back the curtain on the machinery that allowed subprime lending to grow into a global crisis. It wasn't just about bad loans, it was about how Wall Street turned those loans into gold. This chapter reveals how mortgage-backed securities and later their even more convoluted cousin, the collateralized debt obligation, or CDO, became the backbone of a financial system built on sand. The process began with mortgage lenders issuing loans to just about anyone who would take them. These loans were then sold to investment banks, which bundled thousands of them into what were called mortgage-backed securities, or MBS. These bonds, divided into layers or tranches, offered varying levels of risk and reward. At the top were supposedly safe tranches, rated AAA, while the lower ones carried higher risks but offered higher returns. The idea was simple: spread out the risk of a few bad loans across thousands of good ones. But as the demand for these bonds exploded, lenders started scraping the bottom of the barrel for borrowers. Suddenly, loans weren't being issued based on a borrower's ability to repay but on Wall Street's need for more raw material to package into securities. The system fed itself. The more loans issued, the more bonds created, the more money made. This wasn't enough for Wall Street. Soon, they created CDOs, bonds made up of the lower, riskier tranches of other mortgage-backed securities. If this sounds like a house of cards, that's because it was. CDOs were sold as innovative financial products, but they were little more than recycled risk dressed up with complex math. The banks claimed these instruments diversified risk, but in reality, they concentrated it in ways no one truly understood. Enter the credit rating agencies. They were supposed to serve as gatekeepers, evaluating the safety of these securities. But their business model was deeply flawed. They were paid by the very banks creating the bonds. The result? AAA ratings were handed out like candy, even for securities backed by the riskiest loans. This rubber stamping process created an illusion of safety that drew in investors from around the world. Pension funds, mutual funds, even foreign governments. Steve Eisman and a handful of skeptics weren't fooled. They saw the absurdity of the system and the moral hazard it created. Banks no longer cared about the quality of the loans they were packaging because they didn't hold on to them. As one banker infamously described it, when the music's playing, you've got to keep dancing. Wall Street was making too much money to stop and question what they were doing. What's more, Eisman discovered that many of the people creating and selling these securities didn't even understand them. At a conference in Las Vegas, he pressed industry insiders to explain how these products worked, only to find that even they couldn't. The complexity wasn't a feature. It was a smokescreen, hiding just how fragile the system truly was. Meanwhile, borrowers, many of whom had no idea what kind of loans they were signing up for, were the ones being set up to fail. As teaser rates expired and payments ballooned, defaults began to rise. But Wall Street didn't care. They kept churning out bonds, creating more CDOs, and raking in profits. The system wasn't just unsustainable, it was predatory. Chapter 4 lays bare the moral bankruptcy at the heart of the financial system. Wall Street had taken the debts of ordinary Americans, disguised them as wealth, and sold them to the world. The machine was running full speed, and no one seemed willing or able to stop it. But the cracks were growing wider, and for those paying attention, the crash was no longer a question of if, but when. In Chapter 5, the narrative shifts to the unlikely outsiders who stumbled upon Wall Street's grand illusion and decided to bet against it. These were not financial titans but rather underdogs who saw what others couldn't or refused to see. Among them were the investors at Cornwall Capital, a tiny hedge fund operating out of a garage in Berkeley, California. Their journey illustrates how even the smallest players, with the right instincts and an eye for detail, could take on the giants of finance. Cornwall Capital was started with just $110,000, a modest sum by Wall Street standards. The founders, including Charlie Ledley and Jamie Mai, were outsiders with little formal training in finance. What they had, however, was a knack for questioning assumptions and spotting overlooked opportunities. Their investment strategy was simple. Look for situations where the market was mispricing risk and place asymmetric bets, trades where a small investment could lead to massive returns. The subprime mortgage market, with its layers of complexity and unexamined assumptions, was exactly the kind of opportunity they were looking for. Like Steve Eisman and Michael Burry, they began to see that the housing market was far more fragile than Wall Street believed. But what set them apart was their willingness to explore the riskiest and most obscure corners of the financial system. Cornwall Capital's key insight was that the riskiest tranches of mortgage-backed securities, the ones rated BBB, were often repackaged into collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, and given higher ratings. This meant that the riskiest assets in the market were being disguised as safe. They realized that if the housing market began to crumble, these so-called safe CDOs would be among the first to fail. And because of the way the financial system was interconnected, the fallout would spread far and wide. The team decided to short these CDOs, a bet that the securities would lose value. But placing such a bet wasn't easy. Like Michael Burry, they had to convince banks to sell them credit default swaps, essentially insurance contracts that would pay out if the bonds failed. The banks, still convinced that the housing market was solid, were more than happy to take their money. What makes Cornwall Capital's story remarkable is how small and scrappy their operation was compared to the vast machinery of Wall Street. They didn't have an army of analysts or cutting-edge technology. Instead, they relied on intuition, persistence, and an outsider's perspective. They dug into the fine print of financial products, asked uncomfortable questions, and refused to accept conventional wisdom. As their bets against the housing market grew, so did their conviction that the entire financial system was teetering on the edge. They attended industry conferences, where they were shocked by the arrogance and complacency of Wall Street executives. One moment that stood out was when they discovered that even the people selling CDOs often didn't understand what they were. It was clear to them that the complexity of these products was masking enormous risks. By the time the housing market began to show signs of cracking, Cornwall Capital had positioned itself to profit massively. But their story wasn't just about making money, it was about exposing the blind spots and systemic flaws that allowed the crisis to happen. They were proof that sometimes it takes an outsider to see what those on the inside are blind to. In Chapter 5, we see how a small group of outsiders took on the might of Wall Street with nothing but curiosity, skepticism, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Their bets against the subprime market weren't just about profit, they were a wake-up call to a financial system heading for disaster. But as cracks in the system grew, the stakes and the fallout were about to become much greater. Chapter 6 takes us to Las Vegas, where the surreal blend of gambling and finance becomes a fitting backdrop for the subprime mortgage industry's excesses. It's here, at a Wall Street conference, that Steve Eisman and other skeptics confront the very people profiting from the housing boom. The event feels like a carnival, a showcase of confidence, arrogance, and the unshakable belief that the housing market could only go up. Eisman, armed with his sharp wit and unrelenting skepticism, attends sessions hosted by the industry's major players. Mortgage originators, banks, and financial institutions gather to celebrate the success of their latest products, unaware or willfully ignorant of the ticking time bomb in their portfolios. For Eisman, it's an opportunity to probe and expose the flaws in their logic. At one panel, Eisman asks the CEO of a major subprime lender why the company continues to issue loans to people who clearly can't repay them. The CEO responds with a smug laugh, "They'll refinance." Eisman's jaw drops. This was the industry's entire strategy. Lend money to borrowers who couldn't afford the payments, then bet that rising home prices would allow them to refinance before defaulting. It wasn't just flawed logic, it was delusion. The conference isn't just about selling confidence to investors. It's about showcasing the absurdity of the financial world's incentives. Wall Street wasn't just gambling with subprime loans, it was doubling down. Banks had figured out how to make even riskier bets through synthetic CDOs, financial instruments that didn't even rely on actual mortgages but on bets about mortgage performance. Essentially, they were gambling on the outcomes of other gambles. For Eisman, the conference is both enlightening and infuriating. He sees firsthand how deeply the industry believes its own myths, even as cracks begin to appear. Housing prices are starting to flatten, delinquencies are rising, and yet the players in the room continue to act as if the party will never end. Las Vegas serves as the perfect metaphor for what's happening in the financial system. Everyone is betting big, convinced they can't lose, while a few outsiders like Iceman are watching the house of cards sway. The conference ends, but the reality Iceman and others have seen is clear. The housing market is a bubble, and when it pops, it will take the entire system down with it. By Chapter 7, the cracks in the housing market are growing wider, but the world at large remains oblivious. For the skeptics like Steve Eisman, Michael Burry, and the team at Cornwall Capital, the collapse is no longer a matter of if, but when. This chapter follows their efforts to dig deeper into the financial system and uncover just how widespread the risk has become. Eisman's team discovers something extraordinary. Many of the people responsible for creating and selling mortgage-backed securities don't fully understand them. At one meeting with a major bank, Eisman presses their executives to explain how they're managing the risks in their subprime portfolios. Their response is vague and laced with jargon. Frustrated, Eisman famously demands, "Can you explain it to me in English?" What he uncovers is shocking. Even the people running the system have no idea how it works. They're operating on blind faith that everything will hold together. Meanwhile, Michael Burry continues to dig through the fine print of mortgage bonds. He finds that the quality of loans in newer bonds is even worse than before. Borrowers with no income, no assets, and no documentation, so-called ninja loans, are becoming the norm. The industry is scraping the bottom of the barrel to meet Wall Street's insatiable demand for more loans to bundle into securities. At Cornwall Capital, Charlie Ledley and Jamie might take their skepticism even further. They start investigating the synthetic CDO market, where banks are creating new financial products based on bets about other financial products. It's like building a house of cards on top of another house of cards. Cornwall Capital realizes that these synthetic CDOs are amplifying the risks in the system. If the housing market crashes, the fallout won't just affect mortgage bonds, it will ripple through every corner of the financial world. As they uncover more about the system, the skeptics also face resistance. Banks try to dismiss their concerns, telling them they don't understand the market. But the more they dig, the clearer it becomes. The housing market isn't just over-leveraged, it's catastrophically unstable. Chapter 7 captures the growing tension as the skeptics piece together the full scale of the impending disaster. They see the treasure hidden in the wreckage, the chance to profit from the collapse. But what makes their story remarkable isn't just their foresight, it's their determination to confront a system that refuses to see its own flaws. As the housing market edges closer to collapse, their bets against the system grow, and so does their conviction that they're about to witness history. By the time Chapter 8 unfolds, the housing market is beginning to show clear signs of strain. Default rates on subprime mortgages are rising, and housing prices have stopped their relentless climb. Yet, for most of Wall Street, it's business as usual. The cracks in the system are becoming harder to ignore, but the calm before the storm lulls many into a false sense of security. This is the long quiet, the uneasy pause before the full force of the financial crisis hits. For Steve Eisman, Michael Burry, and others who bet against the housing market, this is a time of both frustration and vindication. They see the signs of collapse everywhere, from rising delinquency rates in subprime mortgages to the increasing difficulty of refinancing loans. But the market is slow to react, and their bets aren't paying off yet. In fact, many of them face mounting pressure from investors who think their predictions are wrong. Michael Burry feels the strain. His fund has millions tied up in credit default swaps, and his investors are furious as the market appears stable. They don't understand that the underlying loans are already failing. What they see is a housing market that hasn't yet imploded. But Burry stays the course, convinced that time is on his side. Meanwhile, Eisman's team continues to track the data. They notice a troubling trend. Financial institutions are doubling down on their exposure to subprime loans. Rather than cutting their losses, they're creating more synthetic products and taking on even greater risks. To Eisman, it's as if Wall Street is in complete denial, unable or unwilling to confront the reality of the situation. In this chapter, the calm is deceptive. Behind the scenes, the seeds of the crash are fully planted, but the system hasn't realized it yet. The skeptics know that the long quiet won't last forever. They just don't know how devastating the storm will be when it finally hits. In Chapter 9, the storm finally arrives. The long-ignored signs of trouble burst into full-blown catastrophe as the housing market begins to collapse. Mortgage defaults skyrocket, subprime lenders start going bankrupt, and the ripple effects spread across the global financial system. This is the death of interest, the moment when the market's reckless optimism is replaced by sheer panic. For the skeptics like Steve Eisman and Michael Burry, this is the moment they've been waiting for. Burry's credit default swaps, which he painstakingly secured years earlier, are now paying off. The subprime bonds they were tied to are unraveling, and the banks that sold him the swaps are scrambling to cover their losses. Burry's fund sees massive gains, validating his lonely and often criticized bet against the housing market. Eisman, meanwhile, watches the chaos unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. He had predicted not just the collapse of the market but also the complete unpreparedness of the institutions involved. Banks that once bragged about their risk management are now struggling to stay afloat. The very people who assured investors that everything was under control are exposed as either clueless or complicit in the disaster. What's striking in this chapter is the sheer scale of the collapse. It's not just subprime loans or mortgage-backed securities, it's entire financial institutions. Bear Stearns is among the first to fall, and others, like Lehman Brothers, are soon to follow. The interconnectedness of the financial system, once touted as a strength, becomes its greatest weakness. Losses in one corner of the market cascade through the entire economy. For Eisman, the collapse is both a victory and a tragedy. His team's bets against the market are paying off handsomely, but the human cost of the crisis is impossible to ignore. Millions of Americans lose their homes, their savings, and their jobs. The system that was supposed to provide stability and prosperity instead becomes a source of destruction. By the end of the chapter, the financial world is in freefall. Governments and central banks scramble to prevent a total meltdown, pumping billions into the system to prop up failing institutions. But for those who profited from the collapse, like Eisman and Burry, the question remains: at what cost? In Chapter 9, the reckoning arrives, exposing the fragility and greed of the financial system. For the skeptics, it's a moment of vindication. For the rest of the world, it's a harsh lesson in the consequences of unchecked ambition and systemic failure. The collapse wasn't just a financial disaster, it was a human one. Chapter 10 begins as the dust from the financial collapse starts to settle. The housing market is in ruins, Wall Street is reeling, and the global economy teeters on the edge of chaos. But for the few skeptics who had bet against the system, like Steve Eisman and Michael Burry, this chapter offers a moment of reflection. Their predictions have come true, and their trades have paid off in spectacular fashion. Yet the victory feels hollow. The title, Two Men in a Boat, reflects the strange position these skeptics now find themselves in. They were outsiders, fighting against the tide of Wall Street's arrogance and delusion. Now, they've profited enormously from the collapse of a system that left millions devastated. The scene is both literal and symbolic: two men on a small boat navigating the wreckage of a financial system they had tried to warn against. For Steve Eisman, the victory comes with a sense of moral conflict. He made millions betting against the housing market, but he is acutely aware of the human cost. Families are losing their homes, communities are collapsing, and the economy is in shambles. Eisman's frustration, always a hallmark of his personality, deepens as he watches the aftermath unfold. Wall Street executives, many of whom played key roles in the collapse, walk away unscathed. Bonuses are still being paid, and the institutions that caused the crisis are being bailed out by taxpayers. Michael Burry's journey is equally bittersweet. His investors, once furious at his unorthodox strategies, now celebrate his foresight. Yet, Burry feels no satisfaction. The collapse wasn't just a financial event, it was a systemic failure, and he knows that the same incentives and structures that caused it remain largely intact. Despite his profits, Burry retreats further into isolation, disillusioned with the very system he had beaten. The chapter also examines the broader implications of the crisis. Wall Street's recklessness wasn't just a result of greed, it was a failure of understanding. Complex financial products like collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps had been created and traded by people who didn't fully grasp their risks. The collapse exposed the fragility of a financial system built on assumptions and ignorance, but little is done to address these flaws. Regulators talk of reform, but the deep structural changes needed to prevent another crisis seem unlikely. As the chapter unfolds, the personal stories of the skeptics serve as a lens through which to view the larger narrative. They weren't just fighting a broken system, they were fighting human nature itself. The tendency to chase short-term gains, ignore inconvenient truths, and place blind faith in institutions proved to be the undoing of the financial world. Chapter 10 is a moment of reckoning. For the skeptics, it's a victory overshadowed by the enormity of the crisis they had predicted. For the world, it's a stark reminder of the fragility of modern finance and the cost of ignoring its flaws. The question that lingers as the chapter ends is haunting. Will we learn from this, or is the next collapse already being built? The epilogue of The Big Short, titled Everything is Correlated, brings the story to its sobering conclusion. As the financial collapse reverberates around the globe, it becomes clear that the crisis was far more than a series of bad bets or risky loans. It was a systemic failure that exposed the fragility of modern capitalism. Michael Lewis reflects on the interconnectedness of the financial system, a web so tightly woven that the collapse of one part brought down the entire structure. The skeptics Steve Eisman, Michael Burry, Cornwall Capital, and others had been proven right. Their foresight had earned them millions, but their victory was overshadowed by the devastation they had seen coming. The crisis didn't just ruin financial institutions, it ruined lives. Families lost their homes, retirement funds were wiped out, and unemployment soared. The very people who were supposed to benefit from the housing boom became its greatest victims. Wall Street, however, seemed to emerge relatively unscathed. The institutions that had taken on enormous risks were bailed out by taxpayers. CEOs who presided over the collapse walked away with golden parachutes. The few firms that failed, like Lehman Brothers, were the exceptions, not the rule. For the most part, the system reassembled itself, and the same people who had engineered the collapse continued to run the show. For Michael Burry, the epilogue represents a retreat. Disillusioned with the financial system and its refusal to change, he closes his hedge fund and withdraws from public life. His warning about the housing market had gone unheeded until it was too late, and he had no interest in playing the same game again. Steve Eisman, too, reflects on what the crisis revealed not just about the financial world, but about human nature. The housing bubble wasn't driven by a few bad actors. It was fueled by a collective willingness to ignore reality. Banks, investors, rating agencies, regulators, and borrowers were all complicit in the delusion that housing prices would never fall. Greed and short-term thinking blinded them to the risks they were creating. The epilogue also poses a troubling question. What happens next? Despite the enormity of the crisis, the underlying issues, unchecked greed, misaligned incentives, and systemic complexity, remain largely unaddressed. The same financial products that led to the collapse are still in circulation, and the lessons of 2008 seem to have faded quickly from memory. As Lewis concludes, the financial system didn't just fail because it was complex or risky, it failed because it was built on a lie. The lie that markets regulate themselves. The lie that institutions are too big to fail. The lie that no one could see the collapse coming. The skeptics in The Big Short saw through these lies, but their warnings were ignored. The epilogue reminds us that the consequences of the crisis weren't just financial, they were human. The ripple effects of that collapse continue to shape the world today. The Big Short is more than a story of a financial collapse. It's a story about accountability, greed, and the cost of ignoring reality. The housing bubble may have burst, but the system that created it remains. And as the final words of the book suggest, the next crisis may already be taking shape. The Big Short isn't just a story about numbers. It's a cautionary tale about the cost of ignoring the truth. If we don't learn from the past, we're destined to repeat it. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into stories that shape our world.